Hello everyone, this is Frank Demos and I wanted to make a video going over the basics of Chapter 4. You can see they start off talking about the media of painting, in other words materials. When you brainstorm about, let's say, cave painting, which takes us way back earlier than what the book even begins, most people come to the realization that you have to gather pigments from the earth, things like plants, berries, even blood for red. And then you also have to figure out how to mix those pigments with things that are more sticky and adhesive. Things like maybe sap, animal fat, and very commonly saliva. So that's what the experts tell us in relation to some of these cave paintings. So again, very resourceful and actually pretty good paintings for people who were told are primitive hunter-gatherers, 30,000 some years ago or so, just to kind of start off. And then the book basically talks about tempera, or egg yolk, as being something that was discovered as a great mixing element with pigments that would be adhesive. Egg yolk, for example, comes in the late Middle Ages and becomes a popular source for oil painting and things like this. Then they talk about fresco, which is pigment dissolved in lime water applied to wet plaster as it is drying. And they mention that the thing about this is that since it dries fast, you don't have a lot of room for error. So you need to be very accurate and technically precise with the initial images as they're applied. And fresco is typically common with large wall paintings or murals. We'll talk about the example they give you on page 67 with the creation of Adam. But many of you may know about Diego Rivera, who is a world-famous muralist who has a lot of work throughout Mexico and the United States in particular. This is an example of a fresco, a famous one, Sugarcane, by the great Diego Rivera. And of course, Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, one of the most famous segments of that is the creation of Adam. Again, read about that in the book. Some of the more interesting and maybe even controversial things that have come up is that in recent years, some scholars have indicated that the shape of the chariot of God seems to very much resemble the anatomy of the human brain. So if you're really interested in this, you can kind of check that out. Just a little tidbit I like to throw in. Again, try to go through this section briefly. Watercolor tends to run a little bit more, so obviously that's something that they point out with the use of water as a mix with pigment. Another wet form is ink. So, you can look at ink art. And again, some of the images here you can see very much kind of echo or recall Asian art. This is a very popular medium, especially and in particular with Asian art, and they give you an example on page 71. And again, just to throw a couple little anecdotes or other extra little pieces of information, if you look at traditional Chinese art, you can see a lot of the time it's ink on scroll, so they tend to use some different traditional materials. The other thing you notice on page 71 is that you always see like an inscription. And this is calligraphy, the art of beautiful writing, and usually what's going on here is that there's in traditional Asian art, traditional Chinese art, there's usually a poem that goes with the image. So a lot of times you get this 2-for-1 where they include a poem or an inscription that gives some information about the image. It's connected to the image, like I said, a poem of some sort. So I want to go into the next section, which is the basic elements of painting. And they start you off with line. And, I think all of us know what line is. In geometry, we understand a line is a straight line. We'll talk about that a little bit more, but one of the things that I just like to say and get people onto early on, let me find the image here, is that in art, line can be a little bit more subtle. We all know what a straight, hard line is. We all kind of identify where one color runs out and another color begins. But in some of the paintings that you've looked at in the book, for example, Goya's 3rd of May, the bayonets form a direct line. Eye lines are super important, and in this particular painting there's all kinds of games going on with eye lines, which are more subtle or sometimes called implied lines. So For example, here you can recognize that there is a subtle or implied geometric shape of a triangle. He's looking at her, she's looking at him. So eye lines are very important to kind of get onto when you're looking at painting. Line is not just a hard line like we're taught in math or geometry, but in art it's especially important to recognize subtle lines, and in particular eye lines. So they mentioned a couple more things that I want to get at here. They also mentioned that diagonals tend to cause a little bit more tension in the composition. For example, if you go back to the previous chapter with the Last Supper, when you have very clean symmetry, right, very symmetrical lines, right, perfect rectangles of 4, 4, centered by 3, perfect isosceles triangle, centering 6 and 6, groupings of 3, 3, 3. This is just an awesome example of symmetry in painting. But when you use diagonal lines, there's generally considered by the rules of composition a little bit more tension created. So you can have this strategically. So you look at actual paintings where there's a little bit more diagonals, it's not perfectly symmetrical. That tends to generate a little bit more tension according to the rules of composition. And so another thing, we get into obviously is color. And I wish the book included a color wheel here, but you can see that the cool colors are considered to be, the blues and the purples, the warm colors, the reds, oranges, yellows. This is very obvious and very intuitive. When the sun is out, you have these kind of colors predominate. When it's nighttime, you have, the darker colors prevail. So that the terminology should make very obvious, easy, intuitive sense as far as that. When is it warm out? The other thing is the primary colors, sometimes called number ones, blue, yellow, and red. You can make all other colors from these three primary colors. So to make a purple, for example, you'd mix a blue and a red. If you wanted a red-violet, you could mix a red and a violet, but more commonly what an artist would do would mix a blue and a red, but be a little bit more heavy and proportionate on the red. So the other thing that's important to talk about is they say, according to the rules of composition, if you want to create the most striking contrast, the most striking visual contrast, you would use two colors exactly opposite of each other on the color wheel. And that is a key to understanding some of the things in modern art, especially when we get to Impressionism. In fact, here's that perfect example of the contrast of two colors exactly opposite each other on the color wheel. You have the orange contrasted with the blue. This tends to make the most striking statement to the eye. And of course, when you look at some of the more detailed information on this PowerPoint, some of the other things that are explained is that photography comes out in black and white in the mid-1800s, and they basically capture the three-dimensional concept. And so what painters try to do is exploit and exaggerate some of the things that photography at this time cannot do, which is to exaggerate color for emotional effect. That's why a lot of times in modern art, especially beginning with Impressionism, you see this kind of exaggeration or distortion of color for emotional expressive effect. And there's the classic example of the two colors opposite each other on the color wheel. And so I want to use this PowerPoint and go through some other basic principles and techniques. But before I do that, I want to just kind of draw people's attention additionally to some other things here that we'll back off this PowerPoint for a second, is that the last element they talk about here is texture. So, for example, texture basically just refers to the surface feel of something, how smooth something is or how rough something is. And so you can see obviously examples here of texture where the brush strokes are more cakey. If you look at Van Gogh's Starry Night, you may not realize it by looking at it, but the brush strokes were created like with the swirls were created. Some of them, the swirls in the sky are created with basically using, finger. So just like we finger paint when we're a little kid, so that tends to create a more thicker texture or surface to the painting. So that's basically what is involving texture. The other thing that you should do on your own is look at page 78. One of the things I do in class is I basically show everybody the examples of other additional principles of balance, gradation, movement and rhythm, proportion, variety, and unity. You can look at those on page 78 and see the particular examples that they provide. And one exercise we do in class, in the face-to-face class, is to basically have students identify other examples in the textbook that illustrate these concepts well. We talked about balance, with the Last Supper, in fact, just a second ago. Gradation, they talk about the Sicarios echo of a scream. Movement and rhythm, within chapter 4, they talk about Venus and Mars. Proportion, the Madonna with the long neck that they give you in chapter 4 is actually an example where they distort proportion a little bit. So unity, they talk about Guernica. Variety, they talk about O'Keeffe's Ghost Ranch Cliffs, the contrast between the green and the more tan earth colors. Also just the shapes of the canyon versus the variety that's provided by the different shapes of the bushes there. So that's another important principle you should look at on your own. What I want to do is go through some of the basic principles in Western art in terms of looking and identifying some of the things that involve style. So one of the classic things that defines the majority of the history of Western art is sometimes called classical perspective, one-point perspective. Maybe better names would be a horizontal perspective. Like, in other words, as a viewer, you're set up to look at an image from the viewpoint of being horizontal with it on the same flat plane, looking at it horizontally. So in the Renaissance, they began to discover how the eye sees. And so what they basically discovered and incorporated into their paintings was that, when you look at railroad tracks, we know they're parallel, but it looks like they converge at a vanishing point in the distance. And so as a technique or as a cheat, most of the classical paintings from the Renaissance are going to be organized and structured around an identifiable horizon line. And then if you want objects to appear closer in the foreground, you make them larger in proportion. If you want them to appear further away in the distance, in the background, you make them smaller in proportion. And so this is how they manufactured the illusion of three-dimensional space. Again, in the Last Supper you see this, where it's no accident that Christ's eyes, Christ the Son, S-O-N, his eyes rise on the horizon line where the sun, S-U-N, also rises. So there's a little play going on there with the horizon line. But again, most of your famous Renaissance paintings illustrate this. And this is the classical standard in terms of perspective. Where you want, the ideal is to make it look like a photograph, make it look as three-dimensional and realistic as possible, make the proportions accurate. Even though they didn't know what photography was, this was the ideal and the standard for years and years, for hundreds of years, in fact, up until about the late 1700s and really the 1800s, where you started to see a transition to modern art and using some different techniques to exaggerate and distort for emotional effect. But again, you can look through this. Again, not everybody, of course, does it like the West does, and there's some examples in the PowerPoint here where in Oriental art, they're not all that worried about making everything three-dimensional and perfect. And in fact, here they blend perspective, where you look at the trees from a level, flat, horizontal perspective or point of view, and then you look down on the stream from up above, as if you're in a God's eye or bird's eye point of view, looking down on it. And again, just kind of walking through some of the history of Western art. Some of the other techniques are the dramatic contrast of light and dark. In the famous Baroque painting, the little girl stands out. She's wearing white. She's in contrast with the darker, shadowy things in the background. So again, this contrast of light and dark is a very popular technique to highlight something. It's a fancy Italian name, chiaroscuro, but it basically means a simple concept in visual art is to dramatically highlight something with the use of light and shadow or light and dark. Some of the great Baroque painters like Caravaggio, Rubens, they would use this technique to perfection. You can see the conversion of St. Paul. You have a horse and a person on the ground, well lit, and this is the conversion of St. Paul, where the story is that he falls off a horse, is temporarily blinded, and then he kind of sees the light, kind of similar or parallel to this idea of having almost like a near-death experience, a tragic experience, but then you're somehow illuminated, and you see things in a new perspective. So you can kind of see this as a common technique, especially in the Baroque. The medical students, very highlighted. Same thing with the cadaver, right, to illustrate what's going on here. And this is a painting by Rembrandt of a medical guild, right? So, like I said, in the 1800s, you start to see this more breaking away from the traditions of making everything three-dimensional and so on, and distorting for emotional expressive effect. Turner is a great painter of the Romantic period, and in fact, in many ways, anticipates Impressionism. A little bit more thick and blotchy brushstrokes. So the Slave Ship is a very famous painting by Turner, which again, what he's doing basically is connecting some of the wild, irrational storms and violent sea storms with some guilty conscience of the slave trade, where it's a story about a group of slaves that were thrown cruelly overboard because they were sick and couldn't be sold for profit. So he kind of connects that theme of cruel inhumanity of just human life being thrown overboard with sometimes just a wild, irrational situation in nature where you have violent sea storms and so on. But again, you have this kind of movement away from three-dimensional realism more to kind of distorting and exaggerating for emotional expressive effect. Other famous romantic themes would be the romantic view of nature. The Industrial Revolution is coming in, and there's some fear of technology with pollution and things like this. So you have this corresponding movement of art that's a very romantic view of nature, very heavy on the yellows here, the western landscapes of the U.S. And again, that takes us, like we said a minute ago, to Impressionism, where photography comes out. You have three-dimensional effect captured by technology now, so painters look to do what photography can't do. Another thing that is mentioned here is that these Impressionist painters really had to exhibit outside the state-sponsored exhibits. So the universities, the system basically promoted this style of traditional ways of seeing and doing art, and this was kind of considered a new radical style. Not really all that popular at first. In fact, like we said up in a previous video, stuff like this was pretty much criticized by the art critics and so on. But again, the movement eventually would catch on. So here again, kind of exaggerating the yellows and oranges, very much celebrating middle class people and so on. Is the revolutions of the 1700s and the 1800s. You kind of have more paintings about middle-class subject matter, a movement away from historical subject matter like kings and mythological figures and so on. So again, other little quick notes. This is a famous painting that was created by applying single dots of paint. Again, you see outdoor scenes, middle-class pleasures and so on. The Starry Night, obviously, what we said, with texture created by, the painting with your hand like a little kid. The brushstrokes are created with fingers on the swirls and so on at least some of them. Very heavy on the greens and blues. And just some background to this. I like to take an example just to give some little anecdotes. Van Gogh, if you know his life story, it was filled with anxiety and depression. This was... The main thing here is that you can see that some people find this to be kind of a trippy, starry night. Some people see more depression and anxiety in this. If we read what Van Gogh thought about it, he was fascinated by a theory that said that when you die, your soul or spirit ventures off to a star and becomes part of a star system and the cosmos out there somewhere. So you see these kind of glowing stars, not only in this artwork, but it's a recurring motif in a lot of Van Gogh's work. You can see the church here, even the line here, if you want to talk about line, kind of directing you up, kind of directing your focus upward to the stars in the sky. And so Van Gogh, in fact, did commit suicide a couple years later in 1891. And he was fascinated with this theory about the afterlife and how you venture off to a star. That was a common belief in a lot of the Native American tribes as well as the ancient Egyptians. And again, the scream is another one, a classic, where there's distortion. There's obviously a sharp diagonal that's helped creating the tension. The red in the sky, obviously the strong emotion there. And then if you think about the connection between the title and of the painting and how that's worked into the brushstrokes, technically sound is a wave. So by scream, you see these wavy brushstrokes. That kind of informs the painting as well, to kind of make sense of some of these brushstrokes, which some would have said is sloppy and all that. But again, this is where modern art is going. Also, too, we'll point out some videos in a moment that are on the course website. But one great thing I like to point out with Cubism is that Picasso was fascinated by movement and grew up in an era in the early 1900s where film was becoming, a new sensation, just the idea to capture something. And one of the great ways of understanding Cubism is when you look at Cubism, it's giving you a figure almost as if they're in motion, or you as the viewer are seeing it from multiple perspectives. In other words, you're seeing sometimes a profile shot, sometimes a frontal shot, sometimes a shot from the upper left, upper right, lower left, lower right, as if the figure's pulled apart and then put together and just scrambled, where you see everything fragmented from different various perspectives. And this is the technique of Cubism, which is new and interesting and radical. And a good way of understanding this is that if we talked about the classic perspective, just seeing it from a level 1 3-dimensional point of view, that's the standard in Western painting. Cubism is really in many ways like shifting perspective or multiple perspective on steroids, if you will. So this is one I always have fun with in the class. If you look at some of these double images, what do you see? Do you see an old woman? Do you see a young woman? It sometimes takes people a couple minutes to figure both of them out. They usually see one before the other. Some people are asking, okay, where's the old woman? She's shot in pure profile. So in pure profile, the old woman's chin would be right here. The mouth would be right here. The nose would be here, kind of a larger nose. She's wearing a headscarf. So the angle or the viewpoint or the perspective is in pure profile, just like you see George Washington on a corn. So the old woman is right here. The chin is right here. The young woman is more from an over-the-shoulder, kind of back-rear point of view. The young woman, I should say, her jawline is right here. So you can kind of see it's like an over-the-shoulder. The young woman's ear is right here. The young woman's nose is just slightly protruding out from this, over-the-shoulder view. The eyelash is right here. So you can see the jawbone again of the young woman. So again, kind of combining two different perspectives. One profile of the old woman, one over the shoulder of the younger woman. And some of these are easier to see. This is just left and right. You can see the rabbit with the mouth here. You flip it the other way, you can see the duck beak right here, which is also the rabbit's ears if you look at it the other way. So Cubism, in many ways, can be understood a little better by understanding it to be this multiple perspective, use of multiple perspective, more than one perspective, combined and blended, reducing everything to flat two-dimensional objects. The figures look pulled apart, So again, the one video is great too, that we'll mention on how Cubism tends to lead the way into abstraction, because some people start to look at these images. If you take Cubism and just keep pushing it further and further, Some people would say that this just looks like random geometric stuff as we push cubism further, although you can identify the concept of a spinning wheel like a car in motion. If you look at boxcars in the early 1900s, they were more like carriages, boxy. You can see maybe the silhouette of a driver here. But again, cubism helps push the door to pure abstraction. And this is where modern art goes, trying to be defiant. Some people would say, art doesn't have to be about anything except the pure arrangement of shape and color. It doesn't have to be a bird, a plane, a sunset. So this is some of the concept of modern art as it comes in. And what I would try to kind of gravitate people towards is these are great videos here that will further detail Impressionism and abstraction. The book, of course, talks about these as well. But these are really great videos from PBS, and I wanted to include those. So thanks for hanging in there, and I hope everyone's enjoying the art, and we'll see you soon.